Canada's Minister of International Trade touched down in the French capital for what the press release called a routine G7 trade ministers meeting, May 5th and 6th, hosted by France. Agenda items: critical minerals, non-market practices, low-value parcel rules, WTO reform. On the surface, it reads like the kind of diplomatic gathering that fills a calendar and changes nothing. But the moment you pull the lens back even slightly, you realize that Sidhu did not walk into a routine meeting. He walked into the most fractured G7 trade gathering in years, and he arrived with receipts. Let me lay out exactly what that room looked like when Canada entered it. The week before the ministers convened, Donald Trump announced he intended to raise American tariffs on cars and trucks imported from the European Union. The threat landed like a detonation, days before allies were scheduled to sit across the table from each other. And here is the detail that tells you everything about where the G7 stands right now. According to French officials, the ministers did not formally address that tariff threat within the G7 framework at all. The Europeans would discuss it with Washington, yes, but separately. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer held bilateral meetings with EU Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic on the sidelines, two of the 7 most powerful trade economies on Earth, unable to put their most urgent dispute on a shared table. Think about what that means. The G7, the club of leading democratic economies, the body that for decades defined the architecture of the open trading system, could not agree to formally discuss a tariff threat that one of its own members had just issued against another of its own members. The United States and European Union both sitting in the same room in Paris, essentially talking past each other through separate bilateral channels while the formal G7 agenda moved on. If that were the only crisis in the room, it would be enough. But it was not. Because layered underneath the transatlantic tension was something even larger. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil normally flows, has fundamentally altered the backdrop against which every trade conversation now takes place. The Middle East war's economic shockwaves were expected to dominate the informal session on Tuesday, according to the office of France's junior trade minister, Nicolas Forissier. Energy security, supply chain durability, and the resilience of multilateral trade rules are no longer the abstract policy language of white papers. They are the live conditions in which every minister at that table is operating right now. This is the room Sidhu entered. A G7 where the largest economy is issuing fresh tariff threats against its closest allies, where 2 members are too far apart to discuss those threats collectively, where the global oil market has been thrown into disarray by a conflict with no clear end date, where every assumption about the stability of international supply chains is being stress-tested simultaneously. And Canada walked in with a strategy built for exactly this moment. The first dimension of that strategy is critical minerals. This is not a talking point. It is a structural advantage that becomes more valuable with every passing month of global instability. Canada holds 31 priority critical minerals. It possesses 10 of the 12 minerals that NATO has identified as essential to defense supply chains. The inputs for electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and the weapon systems that Western militaries are urgently scaling up. When Sidhu sat down with his G7 counterparts to discuss critical mineral supply chain resilience, one of the 4 formal French presidency priorities, he was not speaking theoretically. He was speaking as the representative of the only G7 country currently producing graphite domestically. That last point deserves a full stop. Canada is the only G7 member with active graphite production, and it is now dramatically expanding that capacity. In April 2026, the Canada Growth Fund committed approximately $113 million to Nouveau Monde Graphite as part of a $411 million financing package that also includes INI and Investissement Québec. Export Development Canada and the Canada Infrastructure Bank have separately committed $459 million in senior debt financing for the project. The Matawinie Mine near Saint-Michel-des-Saints in Quebec, 120 kilometers north of Montreal, is on course to become the largest graphite mining operation in North America, producing approximately 106,000 tons of graphite concentrate per year over a 25-year mine life. Construction began in early 2026. Commercial production is targeted for mid-2028. The mine is paired with a battery materials plant in Bécancour that will produce active anode material for electric vehicle batteries and energy storage systems, powered by Quebec's clean hydroelectricity. This is not a future aspiration. This is a nation-building project that has already cleared its environmental review, secured its financing, and begun breaking ground. When Canada tells its G7 partners it can anchor Western graphite supply chains, it is not offering a promise. It is pointing to a construction site. The second dimension is energy. Prime Minister Mark Carney has described Canada as an energy superpower, and with the Strait of Hormuz closed and global oil markets in upheaval, that framing lands very differently in May 2026 than it might have even a year ago. Sidhu said it plainly to the Canadian press on May 2nd, days before flying to Paris. India needs 70% more energy by 2040, and Canada has the capacity to fill that appetite. He noted Indian interest in Canadian uranium and potash, and that conversation is already backed by a concrete agreement. In March 2026, when Prime Minister Carney met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in New Delhi, the two countries signed a $2.6 billion uranium supply agreement between Cameco Corporation and India's Department of Atomic Energy. That is not a memorandum of understanding. That is a binding commercial commitment for a strategic resource at a moment when global energy security has never been more precarious. The two leaders also agreed to target a comprehensive economic partnership agreement by the end of 2026, with ambitions to grow bilateral trade from roughly $9 billion annually to $50 billion by 2030. This matters enormously for the Paris context. Canada is arriving at a G7 energy security discussion not just as a country with resources in the ground, but as a country that has already begun converting those resources into signed agreements with major energy-hungry economies. The third dimension is the deliberate construction of a parallel trade network, one that does not depend on Washington's consistency. Sidhu confirmed to the Canadian press on May 2nd that Ottawa is targeting 3 major trade agreements before the end of 2026. With Mercosur, the 5-country South American bloc comprising Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. With ASEAN, the 11-state Southeast Asian grouping. And with India. Canadian negotiators were in Brazil during the week of April 28th for active Mercosur negotiations. Prime Minister Carney personally spoke with Argentine President Javier Milei the same week, with both leaders acknowledging forward progress and Carney underscoring Canada's profile as a leading investor in Argentina's mining sector. On the India track, one of the largest delegations India has sent to Canada in recent memory is expected to arrive at the end of May to advance commercial talks. Sidhu has been deliberate about the framing. The goal is not to sign agreements for the optics of signing them. It is to deliver real, tangible gains for Canadian workers and businesses. That discipline matters because it signals to partners that Canada is a serious counterparty, not a government chasing headlines. Zoom out, and what you are looking at is a country that has spent the past 14 months methodically building a new architecture of trade relationships with Europe, with South America, with South and Southeast Asia, precisely because the architecture that depended on an open, predictable American partner is no longer reliable. Now consider what that means in the actual room in Paris. The 4 formal priorities of France's G7 presidency map almost directly onto Canada's areas of demonstrated strength. The first priority is collective action against industrial overcapacity and non-market trade practices. Without naming China explicitly, this is the unspoken context. Canada's position is that democratic economies must coordinate rather than undercut one another when protecting strategic industries, and that position is credible because Canada has been investing rather than just talking. The second priority is economic security and critical mineral supply chain diversification, Canada's clearest home territory. Sidhu can point not only to Matawinie but to existing critical mineral partnerships signed with Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the European Union collectively. The third priority is the low-value parcel challenge, the so-called de minimis question. The United States suspended its $800 de minimis exemption last year, a move that has created real operational friction for Canada Post and Canadian cross-border e-commerce. This is a file where Canada can speak with authority drawn from direct economic impact, not just diplomatic preference. The fourth priority is restoring an effective multilateral trading system following the WTO's 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé in late March. Canada has long positioned itself as a committed multilateralist, and in an era of American unilateralism, that commitment carries renewed weight. On every single one of those files, Canada arrived in Paris not with talking points, but with documented decisions, signed agreements, and funded projects. And there is a larger inference that ties this all together. Every time the global trading system convulses, every new tariff threat, every closed waterway, every bilateral dispute that cannot be resolved at the G7 table, the strategic premium on stable, democratic, resource-rich, rule-of-law partners goes up. There are very few countries that meet all of those criteria at scale. Canada is one of them. And every shock to the system that makes that combination rarer also makes Canada's position at the table stronger. Carney articulated the underlying logic at Davos earlier this year. Middle powers must act collectively because those who are not at the table end up on the menu. That sentence is not rhetorical flourish. It is a precise description of what Canada has been doing since March 2025, getting to tables before the agenda is set, building relationships before a crisis forces the issue, converting natural resource potential into signed agreements with real partners, and showing up in Paris with a plan that is already in motion. The Paris meeting also feeds directly into a much larger calendar event. The G7 Leaders Summit takes place in Evian on the shore of Lake Geneva from June 15th to 17th. What Sidhu accomplished in Paris, every supply chain signal, every critical mineral commitment, every line on WTO reform, feeds into the hand that Carney carries to that leaders' table 6 weeks from now. Trade ministers' meetings are how the groundwork gets laid. Leaders' summits are where the groundwork gets converted into the communiques and commitments that set the direction of the international economic order. Canada is building toward Evian, and it has been building for a long time. The story that most people will read about the Paris G7 is the story of a meeting that could not formally discuss Trump's latest tariff threat. The story of a Strait of Hormuz whose closure hung over every conversation. The story of a multilateral trading system under the kind of pressure it has not faced in decades. But inside that story is a quieter, more durable story. It is the story of a country that read the disruption coming, decided not to wait for stability to return, and began building the relationships, projects, and agreements that give it options no matter what Washington does next. A country that is now, in the spring of 2026, arriving at the most consequential G7 trade meetings as one of the few members that genuinely has something to offer everyone else in the room. That is what Sidhu flew to Paris to signal. And the audience that matters most was sitting across the table from him. If this kind of analysis is why you come to this channel, share this video with one person who is tracking how Canada is repositioning in the new global order. We do not chase the announcement. We track the strategy that the announcement is part of.